Good afternoon, good evening, Happy New Year. Welcome back to the first edition of the Scott Ritter Show for 2023. Today, we'll be discussing a topic that I think is not only relevant, but is on everybody's mind, and that is the issue of NATO, the collective West, the United States' ongoing efforts to provide heavy weaponry in support of Ukraine in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. There's talk, of course, we've seen issues such as the high mobility artillery system, or HIMARS, and the role that that's played in the conflict. The M777 artillery systems. The United States is now talking about providing Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. The Germans are speaking of providing the Martyr, and there's an ongoing discussion whether or not a Leopard 2 tank should be provided. I couldn't think of a better guest to invite to discuss this issue today than the one we have, Colonel Ralph Bassard, an officer of the Swiss military, a man with extensive experience in artillery and armor, and perhaps most importantly, in 2014, he was a senior member of the OSCE's Ukraine monitoring mission, so he has experience on the ground in both Ukraine and in the Donbass. So welcome very much, Colonel. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hello, Mr. Ritter. I'm happy to talk to you today.
Well, thank you. Look, in the introduction, I talked about the ongoing effort on the part of the West to provide heavy weaponry to Ukraine. From your perspective, is what impact is this going to have on the ongoing conflict? Is this weaponry a game changer? Is it being provided in sufficient quantity and in a sufficient timeline to have a meaningful impact on the battlefield, or is this purely feel-good politics by the nations involved that'll have little or no impact on the battlefield?
Well, thanks a lot for having me today, and I hope you can understand me. It's often the common language that divides us. I think we have to be aware of the fact that there's a war of attrition going on in eastern Ukraine since summer, basically. And the deliveries of weapons to Ukraine have to be seen in this context. The Ukrainian army has lost weapons on a scale that we in the West can hardly imagine. The Ukrainian army has now been rebuilt for the third time, and it was already larger than the country's economy could actually afford at the end of last year. At some point, Europe will have to ask itself whether sanctions against Russia, the war in Ukraine, the policy of open arms towards Ukrainian refugees, and its own region can be financed at the same time. The promised 50 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the 40 Martyrs from Germany, the 10 Challenger main battle tanks that the British government is considering to deliver, and the tank company Poland promised are simply not enough. And we've seen many so-called game changers in the course of this war. Meanwhile, Ukraine, as a consequence of that, is in possession of a hodgepodge of weapon systems in its arsenal. And this is, of course, a nightmare for the maintenance of the systems from the point of logistics in general, and from the point of view of training as well. And in addition, the supply lines are almost 1,000 kilometers long. Large-scale repair work is hardly possible in Ukraine because hardly any employee of the European arms industry will be prepared to go to a war zone On the other hand, the distance between the front and the Russian industry is short. And in this war of attrition, the geographical advantages are on Russia's side, as long as Russia's forces do not advance too far west. I think the Russians should retain their ability to interdict with aircraft and with artillery up to the Dnieper River, but much more, I think, is not required. And the same applies to artillery ammunition, which was fired in enormous quantities in the last few months. The Ukrainian artillery is said to have fired 20,000 shells a day last summer, and the Russians as many as 60,000 a day. These are figures that should rather be measured in terms of railway trains than in terms of individual wagons, and not even to talk about lorries. And now NATO and the Ukrainians want to switch to a uniform 155mm caliber, which is not in stock in the Ukraine and is not being produced there. So every day an ammunition train will have to travel over 1,000 kilometers through an area which Russian military reconnaissance can obtain intelligence from, and in which Russian cruise missiles can hit whatever they want. And these are aspects, of course, that the press in the West is not talking about. And even the supplies of air defense systems is not enough in the huge country that Ukraine is. There will always be gaps, of course. The attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure are not only aimed at interdicting arms deliveries. Rather, the country is to be devastated to such an extent that it cannot be used as a NATO deployment base against Russia for years. I think that's the plan. The war of attrition must be seen in the context of the economic war that is underway. An economically weakened Europe will have difficulty in rebuilding Ukraine, and with the loss of land, of economic and human resources, etc., Ukraine will remain weak at the long term and will be in a disadvantage in a current war against Russia and as well in a future one. The complaints about the lack of ammunition we have heard from the forefront in recent weeks may also have been politically motivated. The Russian armed forces prioritize geography and supply their regular troops with priority compared to the volunteers and the private military company Wagner. And looking at the Ukrainian sources again just today, I see that the Russian armed forces are shelling places all along the front, from the southwest of the city of Donetsk up to Kharkov. And at least on the Russian side, there seems to be enough ammunition available. So without sorting out all these issues, the pure delivery of heavy weapon systems is far from being enough, and it looks rather like a purely symbolic help or symbolic support of Ukraine, just short of real help.
Thank you very much. Let's dig into that just a little bit more. I'm going to ask you, because of your military background and your expertise, we're going to talk about three separate topics. The first is the role of artillery in modern warfare. Then we're going to talk about the role of armor in modern warfare. And then we're going to end up with the role of air defense. But let's start with artillery. In the West, we call it the queen of battle. But in Russia, they call it the king of battle. And I think the Russians have a completely different approach towards artillery. that sometimes makes it difficult for analysts or even laypersons in the West to understand the numbers that you are talking about. 20,000 versus 60,000, et cetera. How important is artillery in the coming fight that's, I believe, is about to transpire, a decisive engagement in the coming weeks and months between Russia and Ukraine? How important is artillery going to factor into this?
I have no doubt that artillery will and already plays a decisive role in this conflict. Attacking well-dug-in troops in well-built defensive positions without a proper artillery preparation is not only useless, it's a very special kind of suicide. And in summer last year, we have seen a significant change in the tactics of particularly the Russian armed forces, which began to systematically prepare their attacks in order to avoid casualties. And of course, this makes advance and progress a bit slow, but there's no way of avoiding it. And sometimes it seems to me that artillery and multiple launch rocket systems in general were considered to be kind of magic weapons that turn the tide entirely and change the game. Particularly in May last year, the American HIMARS MLRS system was praised as a miracle weapon, as so many before. I was surprised even then, because I thought that the Ukraine had weapon systems of a similar kind from the Soviet and its own production. And indeed, Ukraine succeeded in a few strikes against the railway network in the hinterland of Lugansk and Donetsk, as well as in a strike against the Russian soldiers accommodated in Makiivka. But after analyzing the impacts of the HIMARS missiles and the Russian reports about the efforts to shoot them down, I came to the conclusion that HIMARS missiles or HIMARS missions only have a chance of success when shelling targets close to the front, so that the flight time of the missiles is shorter than the time that the Russian ground-based air defense needs to respond. And this means that the HIMARS has lost its function as a weapon for destroying lakes, air force, as well as command and control targets in the enemy area to a certain extent, and lost its reputation of a magic weapon. My guess is that the Russian troops, as a consequence of that, will have to push their Ukrainian opponents back to a line running roughly from Toretsk to Kurakhove, northwest of Donetsk, so that their air defense systems can protect the cities of Donetsk and Gorlovka, or Orlivka, if you will, effectively. But in doing so, of course, the Russians have to be careful not to run into a meat grinder. According to American reports, the United States have only delivered HIMARS launchers to Ukraine, which are technically incapable of launching the ATAK-MS missiles. That gave so many reasons for discussions in the last few weeks. I think at the Arbat in Moscow, the seat of the Russian General Staff officers, could ask the question how far an ATAK-M missile will fly if it carries a nuclear warhead of 100 kilograms instead of a 210 kilogram conventional one. And this as well fits a wee bit into a picture of other arms deliveries that we've just been discussing. The West is ready to provide Ukraine with what it needs to defend itself, but even the United States do not want to be drawn into a war against Russia. And this is particularly to be seen when you look a bit closer at artillery and MLRS systems, but I think we'll come to similar conclusions if we talk about tanks and mechanized infantry.
Well, why don't we do that? Let's talk about tanks and mechanized infantry. We're in a situation right now where, as you have indicated, we're in a war of attrition that's basically built around fixed positions. Tanks and infantry fighting vehicles don't do too well in wars of attrition based around fixed positions. I think historically they like room to maneuver. It appears that the Russians may be about to initiate a course of action that might open up maneuver potential. How would you rate, one, the role that armor and infantry fighting vehicles could potentially play in future combat in Ukraine? And then, you talked about the HIMARS as being a magic weapon, but it's not. Reality sets in. Similarly, we hear talk right now that the Leopard 2 is a magic tank, or the Challenger 2 is a magic tank, or even the most magic tank of all, the M1's Abrams, that if somehow Ukraine could get its hands on these magic tanks, they could change the entire course of the conflict. But Russia seems to be pretty good at building tanks as well. They have the T-14 Armata in less numbers, but they have a great number of the T-90, the modern modifications of these, advanced T-80s, modified T-72s. How would you rate Russian armor versus the magic Western armor that Ukraine wants? And do you think armor is going to play a major role, a deciding role, a decisive role in the conflicts to come?
Although we in the West, we always think weapon systems are superior to other nations' weapon systems, I don't consider these main battle tanks as magic weapons and game changers. Particularly the German Leopard 2, which we possess in the resources as well, hardly being used in wars so far. So it's kind of a black box. We don't really know what this tank is really worth. I mean, in Syria, Turkish tank units are said to have suffered heavy losses of Leopard 2 tanks, and whether this is related to the protection of the tank or the level of training of the Turkish troops is still unclear to me, and don't want to discuss this topic here. The British Challenger tank is well proven, well experienced in Iraq, and with its Chobham armor, it is undoubtedly well protected. The same applies to the M1 Abrams. On the other hand, the Russian tanks are, you just mentioned, are tried and tested. And how effective, however, the various active protection systems of Russian tanks are remains to be seen. Understandably, the Russian side is not willing to disclose any information about this yet. If Britain and Germany do indeed deliver main battle tanks of the most modern design, then perhaps it is the right time for Russia to deploy the T-14 Armata to the front. and we will see if the complaints we have heard about these tanks lately are justified. I'm quite sure that when it comes to protection, it's of the crew, the T-14 is undoubtedly top, and this is a very important factor for an army that is outnumbered, as most probably the Russians are at the time being in eastern Ukraine. We know that the Russian tank design school is traditionally a very successful one. They have built in various times very innovative new tanks. The T-55 was top at its time. The T-62 as well. And Western forces in the last 3 decades have shattered in Iraq and elsewhere forces with a Soviet equipment of the 70s, and probably not even very well trained forces. But this time I think they would face far better trained forces, far better organized, and with a lot of life combat experience now.
Now, in the West, we I can speak for the United States. I can't speak for Switzerland, but we use air power in a unique way. In addition to strategic air power, we use it extensively at the tactical level as a fire support mechanism, close air support. The Russians seem to not be emphasizing close air support as much. They overemphasize artillery and de-emphasize the kind of close air support that Americans seem to be accustomed to. The reason why I bring this up is for the past 20 years, the United States has been flying close air support in Afghanistan and Iraq, where there are literally no integrated air defense systems. The Russians happen to have, I believe, some of the most sophisticated air defense systems available, and they've deployed them in accordance with doctrine. What is the role of air defense, not only in terms of a Ukrainian-Russian conflict that's ongoing, and on that, maybe you could talk a little bit about the role of drones and drone warfare today and how that's developed. But a lot of people today speak about the potential of NATO intervention. And I'm not here to say whether NATO will intervene or not, but there's a perception that NATO's Air Force would give it unsurpassed advantages over the Russians, that if NATO's Air Force were to intervene in Ukraine, that it would have a decisive impact. Do you think NATO's air forces today can defeat Russia's integrated air defense systems?
It's hard to say whether they would defeat the Russian air defense systems, but they would almost certainly suffer very, very heavy casualties. They would lose a lot of planes, a lot of crews, and I think if NATO's air forces were able to play a decisive role in this conflict, they would have tried it already. But again, this time they're up against a very sophisticated, very modernly equipped army with air defense systems that have been developed and produced to go against in a country that has a huge tradition and a big amount of experience in developing and building air defense systems. I mean, already the Soviet forces, but the Russians as well, they always had to take into account that they might be up against Western countries with the most modern air forces probably on Earth, and accordingly they have developed their system of air defense, and I'm quite sure they would suffer heavy losses, and I'm quite sure that this is well known in Brussels and in Washington as well. The Russian air defense is a layered one, so it's not just enough to destroy one system or battery of a particular kind at a particular place. These systems, they protect each other, and as you say, they're being deployed according to doctrine, which I have learned extensively in Moscow's General Staff Academy. And if they wouldn't suffer a defeat, certainly the Western Air Forces would suffer heavy casualties. As far as close air support is concerned, and air interdiction as well, the Russians do quite a lot as well. I mean, they are operating their combat helicopters up to 50 kilometers deep into Ukrainian territory. The CAS planes, the Sukhoi 25s, they're operating much more successfully than the Western press is ready to admit. I've just recently read an article or an entire investigation of the British Royal United Services Institute that tells you about, of course, the failures, but as well about the success of the Russian Air Force, and I think they have been very well in the past few months, and they might continue to do so. We just have to see that Ukraine is far bigger than the theatre of operations, for instance, in Iraq was, and you cannot protect everything, and you cannot achieve air superiority everywhere at any time in this huge country and in the skies above it.
Well, thank you. You alluded to the Russian General Staff and your familiarity with Russian General Staff procedures. Recently, we saw a shakeup in the command structure of the Russians when it comes to the special military operation. General Surovikin, the General Armageddon, a very famous or infamous general, depending on your point of view, had taken command. And from all intents and purposes, he had had a successful time in command. He stabilized what had been an unstable frontline situation. He reinforced, and he delivered decisive blows against the Ukrainian economy and civil infrastructure, especially their energy grid. And yet he's now been removed as the head of the special military operation, relegated to the status of a deputy commander responsible for air power, perhaps befitting his status as an Air Force general officer. Now, some people have called this a firing. He's been relieved. Somebody like myself, however, I look at it as maybe the war is about to change in Ukraine. Maybe the war is about to reach an escalation that requires the Russians to allocate sufficient staff capability. I mean, a general doesn't win battles. The general staff wins battles. And now the Russians have brought in General Gerasimov's staff and the other staffs. Do you see this as an indication of Russian weakness, or do you see this as an indication of Russian preparations for a new phase in the conflict?
latter, I mean, we had a command structure at the very beginning of the Russian campaign in Ukraine that even to me seemed to be a wee bit strange. It was due to the structure of the forces they deployed to the borders of Ukraine in autumn last year, and we've seen many changes since that in the organisation as well as in personnel, in manpower, and the discussion about the new appointments at the head of the Russian armed forces comes as no surprise to me. I can well remember the transfer of General Sergei Kisel last summer as I think he was the commanding officer of 1st Guards Tank Army. And the background of this transfer is a bit closer known to me after talking to my friends in the Russian General Staff, and it turned out to have a different background that was reported about in Western media. My impression at that time was that his transfer had more to do with organizational changes at the top of the Russian army rather than with a conflict between Kisel and Gerasimov or even President Putin, as was reported here. And I was sure at that time that Western intelligence services were passing on unchecked or uncorroborated information from their Ukrainian colleagues, and I thought this was very unprofessional. In general, hardliners in Russia use every alleged failure of the Russian army, no matter how small it may be, to stir up feelings against the leadership of Russia's armed forces, and of course Western media usually take advantage of this quickly. I now think that Gerasimov's appointment is to be seen in a similar way as for instance, Kisel's that I just mentioned. He will surely concentrate command power in his hands. He must be very respected by everybody in the Russian armed forces after serving for years as chief of the general staff, and I'm sure that he will have unlimited access to all military forces in the theatre of operations in eastern Ukraine, and we will see whether that brings advantages and further success or not. My guess in the past was sometimes that the Russian political leadership appointed commanders specifically to implement unpopular measures, and the Russian withdrawal from the northern part of the Kherson Oblast was such an unpopular measure, but probably a very necessary one, and maybe even very planned one. And I could imagine that these officers may have been promised attractive subsequent assignments after taking these or implementing these unpopular decisions and measures. And I know such games from Western Europe too. So the change of the Russian armed forces going on at the time being are to be considered rather as a preparation for next phase than a sign of weakness of military and political leadership in Russia in general.
Thank you very much. Now we come to the last question, which is the million-dollar question. We've discussed artillery, we've discussed armor, we've discussed air defense, and we've discussed command. Put it all together, how do you see the next 6 months, 8 months What's going to happen in Ukraine? Is Russia going to win? Is Russia capable of winning? Or is this a war that's going to drag out over a long period of time?
What you consider as victory, if you consider victory as the capability of achieving one's political goals, then I think Russia is on the right path. Winter warfare is often a battle for built-up areas because the troops need shelter, and that's what's going on at the time being. I mean, in Solidar, the Russian armed forces have shown for a second time already that they are capable of cracking into complex underground defense systems, as they did in Mariupol, where they advanced 1 to 1.5 kilometers per day once they came forward to attack, and mopping up scattered Ukrainian strongholds in the city of Solidar will take a few more days. And in parallel, I guess the Russians will redeploy forces to attack Bakhmut, or Artyomovsk, if you will. Of course, such a change in the direction of attack takes a few days to organize, and Artyomovsk is a bit bigger than Solidar. It's about 5 by 6 kilometers, so that will take its time, and I don't expect success. If it is true that the Ukrainian army really lost 25,000 men in a fight in and around Solidar, as reported by Russian sources, then this is indeed a major blow to the Ukrainian armed forces. But I'm still a bit skeptic about that. Solidar was an area in which a precise force can be used in fights in built-up areas, and based on the assumption that after weeks of fighting, many Ukrainian units are far below their normal strength, I think it's possible that several brigade HQs were in Solidar, each of which might have only commanded a battalion task group. So indeed, the core of entire brigades have been annihilated. We don't know how many troops the Ukrainian armed forces sent into that meat grinder in the past 7 months. I mean, the fights for Solidar have started in May, and Artyomovsk could become a second meat grinder for the Ukrainians. The Russians have now plenty of experience in fighting in built-up areas, which might turn out to be useful at other places as well. So I think the fight for cities will be characteristic for the war in the next few weeks or months to come. In short term, of course, the Ukrainians have to launch attacks, as President Zelensky surely understands that the loss of Solidar was a defeat in the information war, and that he now urgently needs a success that he can exploit propaganda-wise, even if it's worthless in military terms. So I'm expecting spectacular actions from the Ukrainian armed forces in the next few days or weeks. And of course, the Ukrainians can only launch counterattacks at places where they have troops at hand, and after weeks of sending troops in the Solidar Artyomovsk area, they probably have those available primarily there. Driving into a city with a tank brigade is always a bad idea. So the Ukrainians must now try to attack the Russians somewhere between Solidar and Artyomovsk, or outside Solidar in general. The medium-term development might be characterized by further fighting for cities too. Many speculate here in the West that Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk and Seversk may be the next Russian targets. Then the question arises as to how many more soldiers Ukraine can send into combat. On the other hand side, officials in Russia speak of 300,000 mobilized reservists. Whether this number is correct or not cannot be verified from independent sources, of course. But some of these troops were certainly mobilized with regard to other potential hotspots on the borders of Russia or its allies. So the Russian General Staff can now move a part of these troops at will and tie down enemy forces wherever they are deployed, be it in Belarus, in the Caucasus, or anywhere else. I think that is what we are going to see in the next few months, a kind of a ballet of reserve forces from Belarus to maybe even the Caucasus or Central Asia. And once the Western tanks will turn up at the front, and I guess this week, a few weeks as well, they will be of little use when attacking deep defense systems along strong obstacles in the terrain. And I guess that the Russians will now try to reach such obstacles. At the time being, they are not very far from the Oskol River, Seversky Donets, Kasyony Torets, Volcha and Konka, and once they have reached such defense lines, they can turn to defense and let the Ukrainians attack and let the Ukrainians take the casualties that an attacker always suffers. And I think that a defensive line from Kupiansk via Kurakhove to Komishuwacha south of Zaporozhye could probably be held with the forces which can be recruited in the regions of Donetsk, Lugansk, and the southern Zaporozhye Oblast, and of course the line along the Dnieper River in the Kherson area can also be held with little effort. So the mobilized reservists from Russia, the remainder can remain in the rear and intervene in case the Ukrainians break through a certain section of the defense lines. And so the war of attrition will go on, and with the Russians being in better positions, better defensive positions, the Ukrainians might suffer once more high casualties, and maybe even casualties to an amount that will put their capability of continuing the war in question.
Thank you very much. I just want to remind everybody that this isn't just idle analysis by an armchair general, that Colonel Bassard has on-the-ground experience in Ukraine, extensive experience with both the Ukrainian armed forces and the Russian armed forces, and extensive experience with the weapon systems that are being used. So I want to thank you very much for coming on and for talking and for sharing. And I hope everybody who watched today understands you were given a special window into some expertise that might not always or might not normally have been available. That's important because you remember the The mantra of this show is knowledge is power, and you've just been empowered with